he was supposed to do like a very summary type off the cuff discussion of things, and he ended up doing this presentation, and I don't even know how he fit it in, because he was like always with us like, the whole week, and he didn't have the presentation time.
This morning.
And I'm constantly learning as well, like there's a lot of things in that presentation that I didn't know, so, you know, we realize that this is a lot of information for you. Obviously, you cannot receive everything all at once. Me personally, when I read a book, I have to read it more than once if it's a good book, and in research mode. So, you know, we do what we do for, you know, getting it out, but don't feel bad if you can't follow everything. We all had to start from that place. So, mine is a subject on the French Revolution, the rise of the young Europe cults, which I think is an especially important subject to be talking about right now with the whole European crazed, you know, war machine that they want to start building in their eternal war with Russia and company, and that they want to bring Canada into this. So we really need to have a big understanding, a very solid understanding, because it does stem from a lot of the ancient history Matt was talking about, but it follows into the 19th to 20th century and where we're at today. And, you know, to take a note, well, I will end, you know, speaking more on this, but the European Union was initially supposed to be something that America was also supposed to join. And, you know, for people who are not quite familiar with the problems of the European Union, you had a centralized control of your financial, your economic system, your military system, and your political system, and one currency. So obviously, you know, from an economic standpoint, one currency is not the best thing when you have supposedly several sovereign nation states within that collective who have their own, you know, economic structure that they need to, you know, work with. And having one currency is not really going to service the prosperity and the growth of a sovereign nation state, which again is not, like, there's a lot of bad propaganda today that a sovereign nation state means that you have to be, you know, the zero-sum game theory, you have to be against another country. That's totally not true. It actually works in harmony with other countries. When the Americans set up their American system of economics, even the protective, you know, they had protectionism within the American system under the school of Alexander Hamilton, Matthew Carey, Henry Clay, later on the son Henry Clay, and so forth. The idea was never to isolate the United States economically and trade with other countries. It was to enhance it. It was to combat cheap labor that the British free trade was pushing on the rest of the world, which was putting countries who accepted this into a colonial status of agricultural plantation trade with British manufacturing, who would benefit and be able to, you know, basically garner wealth from that. So protectionism is actually for the empowerment of all nations. I think there's a lot of confusion around that today. So I'm going to open up with, as Matt mentioned, James Fenimore Cooper was an important American literary figure, also part of intelligence networks, especially within Europe, France. But he also was working with, I believe, a Polish independent movement as well that had a lot of promise. So he wrote The Bravo, which was also about the Venetian Empire, which is a very good book if people have the time to read it. He has this quote that he said, which I think is very relevant for today. He said, "Whenever the government of the United States shall break up, it will probably be in consequence of a false direction having been given to the public. This is the weak point of our defenses and the part to which the enemies of the system will direct all their attacks. Opinion can be so perverted as to cause the false to seem true, the enemy a friend, and the friend an enemy, the best interests of the nation to appear insignificant, and the trifles of moment. In a word, the right, the wrong, and the wrong, the right. In a country where opinion has sway, to seize upon it is to seize upon power, as it is a rule of humanity that the upright and well-intentioned are comparatively passive, while the designing, dishonest, and selfish are the most untiring in their efforts. The danger of public opinions getting a false direction is fourfold, since few men think for themselves. So again, like James Vannevar Cooper was a very important literary figure. He also, was part of the author of the Mohicans like series that he wrote. And with him and Edgar Poe, who had a bad name. Too much for this presentation, but I have done work on it, and they can see it through our material at the Rising Tide Foundation. Cooper was trying to uplift the what was going to be an American literary culture, because obviously Shakespeare was a big deal for Britain. It's a big deal, like Dante was for Italy, right? Like language was not. The Italian language was not a unified language until Dante. And Shakespeare also did a lot to uplift the language of English. Pushkin in Russia also really helped, because the Russians were actually relying a lot on the French language for their discussion on the sciences and so forth. And you can see that would be really problematic for if you want a culture, right? So there's nothing wrong with having a bunch of cultures. It's good. Diversity. As Henry C. Carey also says in his Unity of Law, who was the chief economic advisor during Lincoln's administration, diversity is a good thing. Diversity doesn't mean that the principles, the universal principles, are different. Just like individuals can be different, but they don't have to be like one person is evil and another person is good. It's good to have diversity. You can have differences in opinion, but it doesn't have to be chaotic. The world that we live in today makes it hard for someone to understand how that can be harmonious, but it is certainly a good thing. And so Henry C. Carey was also making the point that diversity is actually quite important for an economic system, but also obviously a cultural system. So anyway, James Vannevar Cooper is trying to build up that literary culture because it might not seem obvious, but if you have a strong culture, which is the bedrock of a great civilization, not the military, but the culture, you're going to have the people who have the tools to think. And so this was obviously, as James Vannevar Cooper said, was a weak point of like, in a democratic system, Benjamin Franklin said it, a republic, if you can keep it, it relies on an active citizenry, a citizenry that is keeping itself informed, but not just informed with like tidbits of the news. Like you have to really think about things, not just from the standpoint of like even, which a lot of people are not even doing, how do I influence the lives of my children, but what direction should my community be going in, and what direction should the citizenry be going in, which is harmonious with others. Not a zero-sum game theory, because if you ascribe to zero-sum, you've just ascribed to perpetual warfare. So this is a figure from the Reign of Terror, which was what the French Revolution unfortunately descended into. The French actually had fought, many French, like Marquis de Lafayette, had fought for American independence against Britain. And again, Tsar Alexander II was, in charge of Russia during the time of the Civil War, which is obviously a different period. I'm going to skip around just like Matt, sorry. But there is a long train of thought, so things are more consistent than you think. But Tsar Alexander II had actually been approached by Britain and France, who at the time, by then, was with Napoleon III. And they were approaching Tsar Alexander II saying, we are really for the South because like they're for the agricultural product, cheap labor, slavery, and they're like the perfect fit for us. And obviously we're going to root for them. And, if they can't win the war, which they certainly cannot, the best thing is that they can at least get independence, and they were going to militarily intervene on the side of the Confederates. It was Tsar Alexander II who actually played a massive role in allowing America to stay unified by him saying, I not only considered this a casus belli to Russia, which I'll explain in a moment, but he sent a Russian naval fleet to both the east and the west coast for several months. They didn't do anything. They stayed stationary in case the British and the French decided to militarily intervene. And in an interview years later with Wharton Barker, who was a very pro-industrialist, good American banker, not all bankers are bad, he said in an interview with Wharton Barker that I did this not for the love for the United States, but love for Russia. Because I understood that the United States represented a different economic system of industry that was opposed to the global enslavement that the British free trade system had done. Let me remind people, they destroyed the Indian textiles so that they could subject India to an opium production country. Then they could become the global dominance in cotton manufacturing. They pushed the opium on China with the 2 opium wars, and the southern states were part of the system of providing cheap cotton to the British, and it was not ever in their benefit, which I think there's still a lot of confusion today. Most white people in the South in the system were poor and uneducated. They were illiterate. They were living in like very terrible conditions of poverty. And when Frederick Douglass, a slave that was born in the South that escaped to Massachusetts, he said, I couldn't believe that even a black person in Massachusetts was living in a better house and read more newspapers, was more aware of the culture. He went to entertainment in the arts and was more aware of world affairs than the average white person in the South, including even some of the slaveholders. So that should say something to what is the ideal system that they want for a lot of people who think that they're, part of this invited party of supremacy. So anyway, the French Revolution, they wanted to model themselves off of the American Revolution, of course. There was a big fight already in Europe. Jonathan Swift was part of this big fight in England, but these things were very old. They were very well installed in Europe. So part of what America incredibly succeeded at doing within the United States was to create something anew that was not entirely without these things. And as we see, it was later on corrupted, but they were able to create an economic system that challenged this like no other economic system that had ever existed before, as well as a cultural outlook and philosophical outlook that was superior. So the French, tried to emulate this. Unfortunately, it became the Reign of Terror. There were over 40,000 executions. I'll explain in a moment how it descended into this. The Reign of Terror had been led by the Jacobins, who were sabotaging France's desire to become independent and a republic. And one of the insane slogans of the French Revolution was that the revolution has no need for scientists. So obviously they're making it clear what kind of populace they want here. And France was the first ever nation state in history under King Louis XI, who lived from 1423 to 1483. France was actually a leader in the sciences for the longest time. That's why Russia was actually using the French language in their court. German scientists like Leibniz moved to France to live in France because that was the place to be for the up-and-coming new scientific discoveries. The École Polytechnique of Paris was, again, like a huge hub and training center for these things, for good scientific works. And I mean that in the sense that they were for uplifting the standard of living of the people, increasing prosperity. The whole thing that countered slavery so efficiently within the United States was the manufacturing. The use of a pulley system and an ox made $10,000 of slaves obsolete. And why would anyone want to spend more money, have more grievance? And obviously there's a moral sacrifice in having slaves to a system that ultimately costs more and is inefficient. So France had achieved great things during King Louis XI, but unfortunately there was a corruption that was, that's why people they cannot stay asleep. They can't assume that there won't be things. It's not to say you should stay paranoid, but you need to always be informed, just like even someone's own cultivation. You should never assume that you're beyond any fault in life, right? You should have a certain kind of awareness. So the corruption came in. I will also talk more about what this corruption was that came into France, but it did, and it started but France was still a powerhouse in the sciences, because when you do these great works, they have great effects that last for a long time. So people shouldn't get too discouraged either. When you do a really good, significant work, it lasts for a long time versus a saboteur who wants to, pull out the wires, or if something like that stays as a recognized thing, it has huge, lasting, positive influences. So France was a powerhouse still for a while. And I think that's also why that was one of the slogans for the French Revolution, which was, very much against the scientists. And we have to be aware, it's not the political activist that's usually considered the most dangerous to society. Not to, say that political activism isn't important, but it's the scientist. Because the scientist is the person who actually creates something that can really upshift things greatly, that no one in their right mind would say no to, right? Like the pulley system in an ox, for instance, for unloading cargo from a ship, versus you trying to use how many people to get that heavy cargo up. People will just instantly see the superiority of that, and if it's cost effective and everything, which it is, then you wouldn't want that. But the reason why they don't want these scientific endeavors is because this makes people less enslaved. It's very, straightforward. And, we can get more into the profound philosophies of it, but that's the gist of it. This is a portrait of Antoine Lavoisier and his wife, who was also, an intellectual. When I say intellectual, I don't mean a useless intellectual. Had thoughts that had meaning and practicality as well. And Lavoisier was a chemist, and he was, working on a lot of important things in the chemical revolution. And they were unfortunately one of the targets of the French Revolution, and they were killed. So again, the Jacobins started to play a role in changing the French Revolution further and further away from what were the successful principles of the American Revolution into anarchy, in the sense of that it was just chaos. It was uncontrolled chaos. And also this idea that anyone who was born from a certain station in life was the enemy inherently. And I think that we today are all still in a bit of that dangerous place, that we assume if someone has a certain amount of success in life or has a certain amount of money, they must be bad. Obviously with billionaires, it's a different story. I think that it is a bit harder to be a billionaire and be a moral person. But Benjamin Franklin was like that too, right? You can be wealthy, but you can also be good, and you can get your wealth from good works. It's not to say that you can't get your wealth from good works. And again, I think that was another thing that they tried to tell people to keep them disempowered. So the Benedictine order, which Matt so brilliantly laid out, made my life so much easier for this presentation, because he saw this presentation, and he pretty much made his presentation in ways to help with the storyline. The Benedictine order is the source for the Knights of Malta, the Knights Templar, the Dominican order, which will become very relevant to this story in particular of the French Revolution, and the Sovereign Grand Lodge of Malta, which I'll bring up these things a little bit throughout this presentation. So the Dominican order was actually what the Jacobins named themselves after. Their first headquarters was actually within the Catholic Church of the Dominican Order. Also, people should be aware that the Dominicans and the Franciscans played a large role in the Spanish Inquisition, which I think actually has a lot of, techniques that were carried, it was also part of the Crusades as well. But the French Revolution, I think, took a lot of these kinds of strategies in, I guess you could say, a more terrorist-like mentality, or like the bad kind of anarchy, okay? I know there's some people who might think that there's the good anarchy, which is just the benevolent rule of the people, but just to say there's also a chaos factor of mob that is bad, and that's the context that I'm using anarchy in with this presentation. So their first base was established in Paris in 1218 at the Chapelle Saint-Jacques, on the street of Saint-Jacques, and the Dominicans were called the Jacobins in Paris, before the Jacobins of the French Revolution existed. So the Jacobins of the French Revolution were a burgeoning new club. To accommodate their membership, the group was allowed to rent the refectory of the Dominican monastery for their meetings, and they became known as Dominican Jacobins, which obviously is highly unusual because you would have think that there was not a compatibility in vision between the two. Then the fact that the Dominicans would rent out their monasteries is not a common thing for them to be doing, and had to be okayed by the highest level and of a powerful, influential order. So they were allowed to do this, and the Jacobins retained the name, and they called themselves, what was it? The Society of Jacobins, I think, officially. So that's a very important tie to, again, the Benedictine order. This is a picture of the Square du Temple, the medieval fortress in Paris built by the Knights Templar originally. And again, that was making references to ISIS in Paris. I'm not so much an expert in this, but again, the Paris Olympics, there was a video that came out about Paris ISIS during the Paris Olympics, and they're kind of proud about it. They don't keep it secret that there is that connection. So this fortress was later on used by the Jacobins during the French Revolution for like the prisoners during the Reign of Terror, where no doubt gruesome tortures were committed. So again, a weird, tying together of the Jacobins with the Templars and the Dominicans, who all have their source with the Benedictine order. There was also the Maltese Freemason. So Malta had Maltese Freemasons as well as the Knights of Malta, and most of their membership of the Freemasonry form of Malta was made up by the Knights of Malta. So obviously, again, it's like, what, weren't Freemasons supposed to be a threat to the Catholic Church? Like, how do you have so many Knights of Malta who are servants to the Catholic Church in one of the first Freemasonry clubs, right? Because that Freemasonry came back in its modern form from Britain, but Malta was one of the first Freemasonry clubs to come out during this time period. So again, very interesting. It was Formosa de Frémaux, who was a Maltese Freemason who, with the Maltese lodges, were also again tied to supporting the Jacobins. And I don't think I have a slide on this, but if you see on the top left corner, Corse, which is Corsica in English, that's where Napoleon comes from. There's also Mafia connections to that, but there's also, connections to these frameworks as well in terms of Freemasonry, and what will later on we will see with the Mazzini networks of Young Europe. There was also a Young Corsica, which was also largely Mafia based. And I think that there is a connection to Napoleon, which I need to do more work on, but it's not a coincidence. So you have all of this old, influence around the Jacobins, but you also have the British origins of the Jacobins. So according to Mika Paul, who wrote this in his essay, The British Origins of the French Jacobins, most significantly, in November 1789, correspondence from the London Revolution Society directly inspired the founding of the Paris Jacobin Club and the Integrated National Network. The Jacobins formed consciously built from British designs. I think that's pretty straightforward. He continues in his paper, the French Jacobins created their network in consultation with British models. In a rare surviving founding document, the Jacobins of Strasbourg, in their January 1790 Act of Union, described their organization as founded on the model of the Paris Société de la Révolution, created in turn on the inspiration of that established in London. Early Jacobins saw not just a common name, but a direct connection between French and British clubs. Certain Jacobin clubs, such as those of Cherbourg and Albi, grew directly out of literary groups. Even these types of organizations, however, had English origins. Diderot and D'Alembert's encyclopedic traced the existence of formal scientific societies to the Royal Society of London, chartered by Charles II, as the first occasion when philosophers could assemble themselves to search for truths and peace, an arrangement spreading to France only several decades later. So again, the British were obviously not fans of the American Revolution and didn't want this to spread like wildfire in Europe, which it certainly was starting to, and there were a lot of American patriots, including Benjamin Franklin himself, who were in France to help this revolution about. So again, very interesting that the Jacobins had direct ties to British models. Yes?
Is that also the origin of, that was created by the Rosicrucians, so that was the Invisible Collar group.
I was just about to say that.
To be fair, this note I have to myself on this comes from Matthew. So it's just, the note I have is from Matthew, which is, he helps me fill in some of the gaps. The Invisible College was run as an esoteric society of Rosicrucian Kabbalists that took over control of the English government after the ill-fated Republican government had fallen and the monarchy was restored in 1649. Rosicrucianism was inextricably linked to esoteric groups that were created around Dominican friends in the early Renaissance period. Do you have anything to add? I still haven't done enough work on the Rosicrucians, which obviously is a very important part of the story, so I had to ask Matt a short note on that. So to the left is the Dominican order, and I'll say in a moment what is to the right. The Dominican spiritual teachings came, and this is where Christian mysticism came through, was Albertus Magnus. So Albertus Magnus was part of the Dominican order. As we've known now with X-Men, you have Magneto, who is clearly a reference to Magnus, and you have Xavier, who is a reference to the Jesuit Francis Xavier. So I'm sorry, but comic books are propaganda. So you have the spiritual teachings of Albertus Magnus were central to the development of Rosicrucianism as well, which is a huge topic that we could do a whole class on. Albertus Magnus was alive from 1200 to 1280 and had become a member of the Dominican order by the 1220s and appears after the death of Saint Dominic. It may have been Albertus Magnus himself who was responsible for introducing the Dominican brand of Christian mysticism, which he was. So he was responsible for the Christian mysticism, but he might have been involved in the tradition of the rosary. I'm sorry. This calls into question the meaning and origin of the rosary within the Dominican order as well, because the Dominican order is known and credited as the creation of the rosary. It calls into question the French modern rite Freemasonry branch, where they have a blend of Catholicism and Freemasonry, where their 7th degree is the Rose Croix as their initiation. You have here a version of the Rosy Cross in the central, which is the Golden Dawn emblem. So a lot of Freemason clubs also took in the Rosy Cross symbol, which I don't think is so subtle or coincidental. The Jacobins would conduct a direct attack on France's nation-state legacy. France was the first world to create a nation-state, as we already said. It allowed it to be the head of scientific thought. It also had incredible industrial accomplishments during this time. The canal system is one. It was the Jacobins who were, sent out to burn it down. Again, kind of like an ISIS thing too, where why would ISIS be so interested in going after museums and like these old architectural sites as a primary thing in their fight against supposed, modern corruption? The fact that the Jacobins, like Palermo, for instance, that was a very sad story. The fact that the Jacobins were heavily influenced, if not receiving a good deal of their instruction from the British, should make one wonder as to whether this was the intention all along. This is a great quote from Jeffrey Steinberg from his, I think it's his speech, The Bestial British Intelligence of Shelburne and Bentham. He's a bit punchy in, I think, his writing in Webster Tarpley, but I'm going to share some of their quotes. From the outset, the Jacobin Terror was a British East India Company, British Foreign Office orchestrated affair. The bloody massacre of France's scientific elite was systematically carried out by French hands, manning French guillotines, but guided by British strings. Jacques Necker, a Geneva-born Protestant, slavishly pro-British banker, had been installed through the efforts of Shelburne's leading ally in France, Philippe, Duke of Orléans, who we're going to talk about in a moment, as finance minister. He was the brother of King Louis XIV, the Sun King. He also was responsible for bringing in a form of Templars back into France. Although Necker failed to block France from allying with the Americans during the American Revolution, he did succeed in presiding over the depletion of the French treasury and the collapse of its credit system. That's another thing, is the American system of economy also modeled itself largely on Colbertism of France, or the dirigist system, as well as, there was also a Germanic influence in its economy. The economic crisis across France was the precondition for political chaos and insurrection, and Shelburne readied the projected destabilization by creating a radical writer's shop. Speeches were prepared by Bentham and translated and transported by diplomatic pouch to Paris, where leaders of the Jacobin terror, Jean-Paul Marat, Jean-Jacques Danton, and Maximilien de Robespierre, delivered the fiery oratories. So their speeches were written by the British establishment. Records of East India Company payments to these leading Jacobins are still on file at the British Museum.
Gross.
He continues, Bentham was so taken up with the events in France that on November 25th, 1791, he wrote to National Assemblyman J.P. Garand, offering to move to Paris to take charge of the penal system. Now, Bentham is also, in charge of, what's it called, that prison system, where you have the panopticon? The panopticon, where you have, one person that is supposed to be the guard, and you have, almost a Colosseum look around this, pillar of a supposed guard in a station. And the idea is that anyone, and there's maybe a light, shining on things, everyone thinks that at any moment the light could be shined on him, or the eyes could be on him, like the eyes of Mordor. And so that is what corrects your behavior, is this idea. So Bentham is quite obsessed with this sort of thing. He also wanted his body mummified when he died, and his head to be placed between his legs.
Which he did.
What?
Yes. So anyway, he really wanted to be in charge of the penal system of Paris, I'm sure with good intentions.
Or he did.
He also was responsible for the hedonistic calculus, his title. In closing, mathematics based on the pursuit of pleasure. Obviously, a hedonistic pleasure. It should tell you what kind of pleasure. In closing a draft of his panopticon proposal, Bentham wrote, "Allow me to construct a prison on this model. I will be the jailer. You will see by the memoir. This jailer will have no salary, will cost nothing to the nation. The more I reflect, the more it appears to me that the execution of the product should be in the hands of the inventor." At the same time, Bentham was proposing to assume the post of chief jailer of the Jacobin Terror, which sent many of France's greatest scientists and pro-American Republicans to the guillotine or to prison. Bentham made no bones about his loyalties. In accepting the honorary title of Citizen of France, Bentham wrote to the Jacobin Interior Minister in October 1792, "I should think myself a weak reasoner and a bad citizen, were I not, though a royalist in London, a Republican in Paris." So again, I think that's pretty straightforward. So I'm going to jump to, the French Revolution resulted in Napoleon. Napoleon was a guy who sold himself as someone who was going to be for the people, and, not so long afterwards declares himself emperor of the world. So this section is called A New Sun Religion. Now, he's not the first to consider himself the Sun King. As we're going to see, it goes back actually quite a bit. So it's more of, you can say, a religion and a very extreme radical type of ideology with this that unfortunately continues to date. Capri is one of these places that, and with Tiberius, which I'll mention briefly, that continue this legacy. So Napoleon would crown himself emperor and personal head of the Gallican Church, successor to Louis XIV, who I will name in a moment, like to speak more about in a moment. Again, the Gallican Church was modeled off of the Anglican Church. So Matt was saying in his presentation, the Anglican Church came up at the same time as the Jesuit order. And then you have now the French version of the Anglican Church as the Gallican Church. And we're going to see a little bit of the kind of views that the Gallican Church was saying. Because again, the Anglican Church, the head is the crown, right, of this church.
The British crown.
Yes, the British crown for the Anglican Church. And for the Gallican Church, it's the French crown. So Napoleon wanted to continue the Gallican Church, which was started under the Sun King, King Louis XIV. Henry VIII was also part of that operation to start the Anglican Church, which is another story, but also tells you, I think, something. These are some of the things that the Gallican Church was pushing. Again, King Louis self-dubbed himself the Sun King. Some of the bigger parts of this are the French government, which we're going to see it's not really even the French government, it's the emperor, the king, or the emperor, can condemn and castigate the priests if they commit any misdeeds in the exercise of their mission as priests. The church can renounce, anyway, obviously, the church should also be held accountable, but I think this slide is more useful. There are quotes here that Christians owe to the princes that govern them, and in particular, we owe to Napoleon I. So this is when they're trying to revive the Gallican Church. Our emperor, love, respect, obedience, faithfulness, military service, tributes ordered for the conservation and defense of the empire and its throne. We owe also fervent prayers for its salvation and for the spiritual and temporal prosperity of the state. So there's a question, what should we think of those who refuse to fulfill their duties towards the emperor? The answer was, according to the apostle St. Paul, they resist the order established by God himself, and they make themselves worthy of eternal damnation. Question, why are we compelled by all these duties towards our emperor? The answer, it is first because God, who creates empires and makes them according to his will, has established the emperor as our sovereign, has made him vicar of his holy power on earth. Therefore, to honor and serve our emperor is to honor and serve God himself. He would also order this on Protestant and Jewish churches to be organized in the same way as servants of his empire. Jacques Cheminade, he wrote an interesting quote in his paper, Time to Destroy the Mythology of Bonapartism. Around this, all kinds of mythologies developed about the Emperor Napoleon. The most significant one was a sun cult. The sun of the Battle of Austerlitz was never going to set, and Napoleon was going to follow it towards the east to become the emperor of the two worlds. Remember that Louis XIV had established a similar cult. He was called the Sun King and had built a temple of Apollo. And again, remember that line that Matt had of all the way towards Armageddon. It passed through Delphi. The cult of Delphi was in service to Apollo as well. Next to the Versailles Palace, on the model of Tiberius's temple at Capri. This is what King Louis wanted to model himself off of, right? The temple of Apollo and Tiberius's temple at Capri. A direct challenge to Christianity. There is indeed something weird and rotten in the kingdom of France. And this is just a picture of Tiberius's temple in Capri. Here's a painting that was painted in 1881, but I think is pretty useful, of the orgy of the times of Tiberius on Capri, and you can see human sacrifice and the bacchanalian frenzies of the moon in the picture. Again, Matt's series, The Mystery Cults, is very useful for getting more content on that. This is the Fountain of Apollo that King Louis built. This is the original construct with obelisks, with the fountain at the bottom, you can see. And this is King Louis as Apollo in the Ballet Royal de la Nuit, the Royal Ballet of the Night. And again, now we're going to see that King Louis, and we'll later see too that Bonaparte also played a huge role in corrupting, you can say, French Masonry. So there were good Freemasons in the world. The American story, I think, is too big to tell today, but the American infiltration stemmed from what this story is going to talk about. So it's relevant to the American story anyway. So King Louis is supposed to be someone who said no to the Freemasons. He got rid of all of this sort of stuff. Napoleon also has this reputation. And C.W. Hackthorne writes in his Secret Societies of All Ages, we read that several lords of the Count of Louis XIV, including the Duke of Gramont, the Marquis of Biron, and Count Taillard, formed a secret society whose object was pleasure. The society increased. Louis XIV, having been made acquainted with its statutes, banished the members, supposedly, whose denomination was, they admitted, a slight resurrection of the Templars. In 1705, Philip, Duke of Orleans, so that's his brother, that's King Louis XIV's brother, is Philip, Duke of Orleans, collected the remaining members of that society that had renounced its first scope to cultivate politics, and a Jesuit father, Bonani, a learned rogue, fabricated the famous list of supposititious Grand Masters of the Temple since Molay. In other words, he made up a fictitious list to claim that the last Templar, Molay, actually had a continuation of line of Grand Masters that continued to this time of Philip, Duke of Orleans, and King Louis XIV. So it was the Jesuit Bonani who was in charge of this document that made what they claimed their own grouping now legit, which was a form of modern Templars. Let me just look at those notes I have here on the side. I don't think there's anything bad. So here's a picture, a painting that King Louis XIV paid for and asked for, of them being portrayed as Roman gods in a 1670 painting by Jean Nocret. And you can see King Louis and Philip Duc of Orleans. They look almost like twins, except one is like a lot more buff, I guess, to project his godlike status. Probably not accurate. Anyway, so Hector continues. Tradition says that on the destruction of the original Order of Templars in 1312, many of its members took refuge in Scotland. I already mentioned this in the last class. I don't want to maybe go over it too much, but the point being is that there is a lot to say that Robert the Bruce was part of this receiving. I don't think they only went there. I think that there was also some things that happened in Britain which I haven't done enough work on. But unfortunately, Robert the Bruce seems to be part of that. That would explain why there's so many Scottish oligarchs that are such assholes. And he had actually been the one to screw over William Wallace during the Irish Revolution that had Scottish, part of it. And he was one of the betrayers of William Wallace, and the movie is accurate that he was killed the way he was killed. But then Robert the Bruce has a change of heart, and he leads the independence movement for Scotland and wins it in a few battles, and they have 100 years of no problems, which makes you kind of wonder, were there deals behind that situation? And the Scottish Rite seems to be tied with a lot of this. I mean, it's called the Scottish Rite anyway. But C.W. Hagthorne also says these philosophic degrees of the Scottish Rite. We see some connections now with the sun theme. They had Knights of the Sun. They had also been known to practice Kabbalah, magic, conjuration, alchemy, demonology, all this. In 1766, they had an order called the Blazing Star. The Temple and the Jesuits were strangely intermingled. It's a lot. I'm just giving little tidbits, but I do write more about this on my Substack through Glass Darkly, which eventually it's going to become, I think, better cohesive when I have a book out. But these are still very important elements that are going to bring us to today. This is a painting of the consecration of Emperor Napoleon I, and you can see the Pope, behind him, clearly in a submissive position, Pope Pius VII. And so this was going to be the modern empire. And with Napoleon himself, there's also a lot of Roman, symbology in this painting that he okayed by the same painter, who also painted, I think, Antoine Lavoisier. But anyway, you gotta make some money, I guess. Wait, I think it's so good. So Jacques Cheminade continues Napoleon's older brother, again, very much like King Louis' situation. King Louis I don't have anything to do with Freemasonry. Napoleon's also saying this, but his brother Joseph is really into it. And, they're claiming that their courts don't have it, but it's so clear if your brother is into it, how can you claim that your court doesn't have any of these things going on? So his brother had joined Marseille's Lodge of the Perfect Sincerity, Scottish Rite. Louis, another of Napoleon's brothers, had also joined a Scottish Rite lodge. Both of Napoleon's brothers were members of the Scottish Rite, and although there's no definite proof, it seems that Napoleon himself was also a brother, Freemason brother, because his son, the eaglet, appears in various documents as Loetin, which means the son of a Mason, which implicates Napoleon as a Mason. There's a lot to go here. I don't know if I'm going to go over it too much, but I'll just say, I think maybe I should just change the batteries. There's also this person called Combassel, who was also the head of all of pretty much the Freemason clubs. I'm still full? Okay, so is the angle I was holding that. So it was a form of takeover, because there was good French Freemasonry that existed, and you can kind of view this as a sort of takeover. It was a similar situation in America where the Scottish Rite basically took over all of the Freemasonry, even the Mormon form of Freemasonry. All of this had to bend the knee to the Scottish Rite, who bent their knee to the Grand Lodge of England. So this was a centralization and takeover of Freemasonry under Napoleon with Combassal. If people want to know more, they can read Jacques Chaugnat's paper or read my Substacks. So we're going to skip ahead now to the Mazzini networks, the British origins of Mazzini and the young year of cults. There's a quote, "If devil has a son, surely it's Lord Palmerston," who was central to a lot of the worst things that happened in a century. It's quite incredible and impressive in some ways. So he was a disciple of Jeremy Bentham, the guy who was really pick me as the jailer of the prisoners of the French Revolution. And he was the most powerful leader of the British oligarchy between 1830 until the end of the American Civil War. Webster Tarpley writes about Giuseppe Mazzini, who was a servant of his. Mazzini had concocted a very effective terrorist belief structure. I have about 15 minutes left, if that gives people a bit of extra energy. Mazzini has concocted a very effective terrorist belief structure. Mazzini is a Genoese admirer of the diabolical Venetian friar Paolo Sarpi. Mazzini's father was a physician to Queen Victoria's father. For a while, Mazzini worked for the Carbonari, one of Napoleon's Freemasonic fronts. Then in 1831, Mazzini founded his Young Italy secret society. Mazzini teaches that Christianity developed the human individual, but that the era of Christianity, of freedom, of human rights, is now over. From now on, the protagonists of history are not individuals anymore, but peoples, understood as racial nationalities. Mazzini is adamant that there is no inalienable human rights. There is only duty, the duty of thought and action to serve the destiny of the racial collectivities. Liberty, says Mazzini, is not the negation of all authority. It is the negation of every authority that fails to represent the collective aim of the nation. By the way, the only monarchy he recognized was the British monarchy. Oh. There is no... Just see that. There is no individual human soul, only a collective soul. According to Mazzini, the Catholic Church, the papacy, and every other institution which attempts to bring God to man must be abolished. Every national grouping that can be identified must be given independence and self-determination in a centralized dictatorship. In the coming century, Mussolini and the Italian fascists will repeat many of Mazzini's ideas verbatim. Mazzini thinks that each modern state has a mission. For some strange reason, there is no mission for Ireland, so Mazzini does not support the independence of Ireland. There is only one monarchy which Mazzini supports because he says it has deep roots among the people, you guessed it, Queen Victoria. Mazzini preaches an Italian revolution for the Third Rome. After the Rome of the Caesars and the Rome of the popes comes the Rome of the people. For this, the Pope must be driven out. From March to June of 1849, Mazzini ruled the Papal States as one of the three dictators, all Grand Orient Freemasons. During that time, death squads operated in Rome, Ancona, and other cities. Some churches were sacked and many confessionals were burned. For Easter 1849, Mazzini staged a monstrous mock Eucharist in the Vatican he called the Novum Pascha, featuring himself, God, and the people. During this time, he was planning to set up his own Italian national church on the Anglican model. The defense of Rome, again, he was someone who also had, again, a certain amount of absolute power for a temporary amount of time, and you see what it was. It was a dictatorship. He was supposed to be for the people, and he claims himself almost like an emperor as well, although his was very short-lived. The defense of Rome was organized. His forte was creating terrorist cells that were the young Europe cults that would infiltrate things. It wasn't really, I think, a Napoleon material. The defense of Rome was organized by Giuseppe Garibaldi, who had joined Mazzini's Young Italy in the early 1830s, but a French army sent by fellow stooge Louis Napoleon drove out Mazzini, Garibaldi, and their supporters. Lord Palmerston said that Mazzini's regime in Rome was far better than any the Romans have had for centuries. You can see there are factional fights here, but they are all in agreement of the end goal, and that's, what will help us for not getting confused and getting drawn into soap opera antics. And again, just remember that Napoleon and Mazzini were also on the payroll of the British, though they opposed each other. Mazzini in London, enjoying the support of Lord Ashley, the Earl of Shaftesbury, a Protestant fanatic, also happens to be Lord Palmerston's son-in-law. This is how they work, right? Everybody is related to everybody. Mazzini's direct access to the British government payroll comes through James Stansfield, a junior lord of the Admiralty and very high official of British intelligence. Last year, Stansfield provided the money for Mazzini's Roman Republic. I'll skip ahead because I think that... Yes.
Lord Ashley, the Earl of Shaftesbury, he's also the founder of Zionism.
Oh.
Yeah, it's the same guy. He's working with Darby to create... later.
Matthew just said that Lord Ashley is the creator of Zionism for the recording version.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. Same funder for Mazzini is the funder of Zionism. So he founds Young Italy in 1831. Garibaldi and Louis Napoleon are also part of this. Mazzini founds the Young Europe in 1834. Italian, Swiss, German, Polish components follow in the Young, Germany, Young Poland. Young Europe was built as the Holy Alliance of the Peoples, opposed to Metternich's Holy Alliance of Despots. 1835, you have Young Switzerland. You have Young France, you have Young Corsica, which I was bringing up before, where Napoleon is born, and you have the French Corsicans, who are the French Mafia, who end up also having a bit of a tiff in Vietnam over opium possession with the CIA. By the end of the century, we have Young Argentina, Young Bosnia, Young India, Young Russia, Young Armenia, Young Egypt, Young Czechs, but similar groupings in Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Greece, followed by Young America, Young Turks as well. This is all part of the grouping, and you have also the Bernard Brith, which is also a part of this operation. So for Mazzini, a nationality means race, a fixed array of behavior like a breed of dog or a species of animal. So blood and soil. Right? He's not thinking, and we have to say when we traveled in Europe, a lot of lovely, lovely people, but they often think that they are the chosen people, not in like a violent way necessarily, but they think they're a chosen people, which is inherited by the soil that they were grown up in. And it's problematic, when you even have some of these more peaceful ideas of blood and soil, where you think there's a superiority in that compared to other peoples. He's not thinking of a national community united by a literate language and classical culture to which any person can become assimilated through a political choice. For Mazzini, race is unchangeable. Race is destiny. It is a matter of blood and soil. Each of Mazzini's organizations demands immediate national liberation for its own ethnic group. So again, you see a young this, young that, young that. It was all for a blood and soil identity, which obviously is going to cause a lot of chaos if they have any kind of imperialistic concept of their identity. Mazzini's workhorse is the territorial imperative. Each is obsessed with borders and territory, which they don't agree with the present borders and territory. Each finds a way to oppose and sabotage judicious economic development. Each one is eager to submerge and repress other national groupings in the pursuit of its own mystical destiny. This is Mazzini's racist gospel of universal ethnic cleansing. So I have just like 3 more slides. We now skip ahead to the 1940s. Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi is the father for Pan-Europe, the concept for Pan-Europe. The Coudenhove line, he writes in his own, he wrote like 3 autobiographies of himself. I think he might have thought he was going to die and then he lived a little bit longer. He wrote more stuff. But they're all quite wacky. Like he admits so much in his autobiographies. The Coudenhove line, and he's a descendant of the Habsburg Empire. His father was Jesuit trained. He worked in Japan. He was someone who knew several languages, his father. He's actually someone who wrote a very influential book on redefining anti-Semitism. He's saying people should not be anti-Semitic, they should be for Zionism, because they should just leave, right? You should encourage them to leave and go somewhere else. And obviously there were geopolitical machinations in this, and his father played a big role in trying to reshape this idea and making anti-Semites pro-Zionism. So anyway, he writes in his autobiography, the Coudenhove line reaches back to the 11th century. That's his family. When 2 brothers Coudenhove joined the First Crusade in 1099, when Jerusalem was conquered for the first time by the united armies of the Christian Knights of Europe, they had belonged to the oldest nobility of northern Brabant, now a part of the Netherlands. At the end of the 18th century, the Coudenhoves had been made counts of the Holy Roman Empire. This is the concept here is of Coudenhove's proposal for the Pan-Europe flag. He writes himself in his autobiography that the yellow circle is the Apollo sun, and the cross is a crusader symbol, and then you have the stars around it, which I don't know if the stars mean anything. And so we have these different versions of the flag, and finally they settled on the empty space in the middle, which again we think is kind of like a secret inference to the Apollo sun crusader symbol in the middle. And again, his idea, Coudenhove's idea, which we're going to actually see in this next quote, was for a kingdom of Jerusalem. So in his 1954 autobiography, he writes, I discovered to my surprise that the feeling of European consciousness had first shown itself during the Crusades. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the Crusades represented the most vigorous display of European solidarity. For a time, feuds between kings, princes, and cities were submerged in a common cause. The first program for Pan-Europe came from the pen of Pierre Dubois, a court lawyer of King Philip of the Fair of France, under the heading Reconquest of the Holy Land. It advocates the setting up of a European League under the presidency of the King of France. This league would have 2 objectives. First, to ensure permanent peace within the Christian world, which is not really true when you look at the role of the Protestant versus Catholic. And secondly, to rally and arm strength of Europe for the reconquest of the Holy Land and the Mediterranean. From that time onwards, many writers and statesmen began to support the idea of Pan-Europe. Its greatest protagonist in the 18th century was the Abbé de Saint-Pierre. He had 2 great philosophers as his disciples, Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Immanuel Kant. In the 19th century, it was Napoleon who first endeavored to unite Europe by force of arms. This is all from his autobiography, who first endeavored to unite Europe by force of arms. After his fall, the Holy Alliance created a pan-Europe of sovereigns for the prevention of wars and revolutions. Finally, in 1834, Mazzini founded Young Europe, a movement designed to coordinate all existing revolutionary movements with a view to building up a new and united Europe on a basis of nationalism and democracy. You see how that's working out today? Kalergi continues, fascism at the time in Italy had not yet broken with parliamentarism and democracy. The new Italian government was a government of coalition. It respected the principle of constitutional monarchy, always again a constant theme with these people, pretending only to give it new vigor and authority. It appealed to the heroic instincts of youth, to the spirit of sacrifice and of idealism. It tried to restore the respect for religious values and the glorious traditions of the ancient Rome. It hailed the memory of Mazzini as a forerunner of fascism, and he does not think that's a bad word. He thinks Hitler sullied that word, and that Mussolini should have been the representation for fascism to unite Europe. He also says, I chose the sign of the Red Cross superimposed on a golden sun as the emblem of our movement. The Red Cross, which had been the flag of the medieval crusades, seems the oldest known symbol of supranational European brotherhood. In more recent times, it has also gained recognition as a symbol of international relief work. The sun was chosen to represent the achievements of European culture in helping to illuminate the world. Thus, Hellenism, which is a reference to the Greeks, and Christianity, the cross of Christ, and the son of Apollo, again, Apollo of Delphi, I would think of it in terms of the Greek reference, figured side by side as the twin enduring pillars of European civilization. I don't want to really end on a sad note, so this is my last slide that I just kind of like pushed in. But we started on Cooper and the importance of literature and culture, of higher ideas, because Schiller he wrote the moral institution of theater, or theater considered as a moral institution. It's very short read, it's like 5 pages, but it's very good because he's making the point that theater, or this also goes for film, you can give people lessons so that they don't have to live up a tragedy for themselves. And we can have an education through these things instead of just, a kind of base entertainment. There are things that you can learn through the lives of others, and it doesn't have to be like a perfect history. It can also be fictional, like Shakespeare mixed, these things together. So did Schiller, who wrote plays, they were turned into operas by Verdi. But as Schiller had said, in his aesthetical letters, how could it be that such a pregnant moment, such a moment full of opportunity failed in reference to the French Revolution? This great moment had found a little people. I think that that's something we should keep in mind of today. In other words, the objective condition for political change was there, but the subjective moral condition was lacking. And therefore, Schiller said, from now on, all improvements in politics must come through the ennoblement of the individual, for which he wrote the aesthetical letters as an education on this, as well as his plays and so forth. I'll end it on that, and then Matt can wrap it up and make it maybe somewhat cohesive.
I think that was great. I don't know, that was a perfect ending. I think you were very cohesive. I think the whole point of the past, the reason why I failed history class in high school was because I was told that the past is about trying to memorize events that I have to know on a timeline to pass a test, devoid of causation. There was no ability to make recourse to explain why things happen. It was just like, why do wars happen? Oh, well, Hitler failed art school. So he wanted to he's overcompensating and, made Nazi party and tried to dominate the world. And why did Napoleon try to conquer the world? Well, he had a little penis. And so, overcompensating, and so he tried to become the emperor. And so...
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah, basically shut up, so don't think about it. and each one of these major events is disassociated. So there's narratives associated to explain away things that detach all of these major events from any continuity that would otherwise help us understand, if we were looking at it in a sober way, how the events that were happening when Rome was seeing Cicero murdered for trying to defend the principle of republic, knowing that Rome could slip into becoming an empire if it was stupid. That is actually directly connected to the events of 1776 in a greater degree than people realize, and much more connected to what we're living through. So there's a way of looking at history which is based upon a battle of ideas that are universal and that are always true, and as true as they were 2,000 or 5,000 years ago as they will be 2,000 years in the future, right? So knowing that we live today as the product of battles over ideas of what the future could be or should be, is everything. So whether or not those ideas manifest to greater or lesser degrees, and whether or not they were tied to natural law or not, should be the subject of real science, the science of history. And knowing then that people like Ben Franklin and his work as a discoverer of God's laws, right, was not something detached from his work as somebody who put into motion a process that uplifted the culture in order to manifest on earth something that would more closely approximate God's laws, morally speaking, from a political domain, evidenced in 1776, should not be something that is hard to think about. Like, we should be able to make sense of that at a young of an age as possible, but we don't. It's very hard for people to think about because we live in the society that we live in, a capistocratic oligarchy. I'm going to use that all the time now. So now we are living in the wake of these past ideas and this continuous battle, and we are living in the past of future people who have come into being, right? Future historians will look upon us from the standpoint of people who either achieved or failed to achieve a sense of acting on their responsibilities. That's a fact, right? So knowing that, how does that change how we think about our position within a process, within a context? And from that standpoint, I really love what you did. I thought it was great. I hope that we provoked people to not maybe think that the idea wasn't to give all of you guys a sense that all of this stuff is like yours to own, because it's not. We don't even know a lot. Like, we're hypothesizing things that we're trying to share on our ongoing journey of discovery and research, and that we manifest in books and things. But we don't have all the answers. We do have certain ideas of what makes the oligarchy afraid, what works and what doesn't work, what causes good people to self-sabotage. So within the context of an obvious shift that we're living in, we have Canada. Mark Carney just announced that Canada is going to be enmeshed into the European Union. He just announced it, right? June 23rd. The Canada-European Comprehensive Partnership Pact. We're in it. We're not there in the European Union, but we're in it. We're steamrolling it in, right? We're part of the NATO expansion for, what is it called? The
Coalition of the Willing.
Coalition of the Willing. Yeah, rearm Europe.
Yep.
Right? So Canada got a lot of resources. Yeah, well, if they're looking at Alberta, these technocrats are looking at Alberta from the militaristic standpoint, then okay, we've got a bunch of
God willing.
unobedient civilizational forces that have to be subdued because they're not playing along with the New World Order. So, we've got all these resources and deposits that could be used, developed, and militarized to destroy rivals. So Alberta's got a lot of resources. We can maybe use that, but not let it benefit the people, not let it benefit any kind of idea of nationalism. They're doing the same thing in Europe with Mark Carney's old buddy Mario Draghi from Goldman Sachs, both, who are both part of the same operation and put forth the idea of stealing people's savings from banks that they kind of want to turn into a bail-in to recapitalize the banks as part of an idea of creating a military-industrial program for Europe, which is exactly what Kalergi was talking about 100 years ago.
Great taking.
The great taking idea, yeah. So these are sick ideas. We know what they're afraid of. We know they want to destroy Russia. There's a big military encirclement of China, which is an ally of Russia. Iran has obviously been targeted. We know that there's all of these civilizational forces that don't want to necessarily commit mass suicide. And they spent the last decade trying to beg us to wake up and work to cooperate on something that's beneficial to everybody. So far we've said no every chance we've gotten. But, as far as I'm seeing it, we still have a window of opportunity. We're not dead yet. So there's definitely still signs of life. And I see, like I said at the beginning, when we come to Alberta, it's enlivening to see people who actually have a sense of living patriotism and problem solving intact and moral aptitude to actually think through problems with an idea of solving them. So that's great. Something to work with. And definitely, same thing, I go to the United States a lot, and there's a lot of wonderful MAGA people that I encounter who are definitely hungry for an understanding of the historical forces that gave rise to our problem and the solutions that are available to us. So there's something there. I don't exactly know what mechanical pathways are, what the mechanics are of actually getting out of this. That's up to all of us to collaborate on. but it's definitely there. And based on what Schiller was saying, what Cooper, what Poe, what every Benjamin Franklin was looking at and doing, I think there's a lot to work with for the best of humanity. But we got to know about the evil. It's hard to look at. It's troubling to look at. It might involve us realizing that Canada is much more of a fake, sick, pseudo country than we realized, and that's unfortunate. But it's a thing that we can. But then we can start thinking about solutions and have dialogue around that.
Yeah, the best part about being an idiot is something you can fix.
That's great, Mike. So let's just have a discussion before we grab a bite to eat.